and EarthLife Africa. Along with us, International Rivers, we are organizing this space to understand JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which are proliferating. The fourth JETP was announced last month, and we are going to hear of more JETPs. And what do JETPs really mean? What does a Just Energy Transition Partnership mean? What does just mean in the context of shrinking civic spaces in countries across the world? Before we move forward, I would like to take this opportunity it's my honor to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Thuli Brilliance Makoma. Thuli is an environmental attorney from Swaziland. She's the executive director of Young Nawe, the Friends of the Earth Swaziland. She's a Goldman Prize winner, Earth Prize winner from 2010. Thuli centers communities in decision-making around environment. She's also a senior advisor to Oil Change International, and I'm honored to be on a panel that will be moderated by her. So I'm going to pass on the mic to Thuli now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Guneet. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our event this afternoon, which is going to be looking at a very important part of the just transition that we are all talking about. We are going to be looking at the just energy transition partnerships, and a critical pillar of that conversation that we'll be looking at this afternoon is about public participation. We know how JETPs generally have been focusing on financing mechanisms and other governance arrangements, and in the process we've lost out on a focus on an important and critical pillar around the transition, especially if we want to bring to life the just component of the transition. So that part is public participation and transparency. And for that to effectively happen, we need participation of civil society, we need participation of communities, we need the real meaningful participation from all stakeholders. And so far, we have seen mixed models of public participation, and in some instances, none at all. And so this afternoon, we're going to be hearing from panelists, esteemed panelists who have engaged with aspects of the JETPs, especially around the pillar on public participation and the angle of defenders, environmental defenders. So to start us off in this discussion, which is going to really focus on experiences around the countries where JETPs are already happening, we know that currently it's South Africa, it's Indonesia, it's Vietnam, and Senegal that are actually part of the JETPs. So we're going to hear bits of experiences around how that is going, how the public participation and accountability framework within the national JETP processes is going. I have an esteemed panel of speakers to help us through this afternoon, and I have Makoma, Lekalakala, who is the director of EarthLife Africa, an environmental organization based in South Africa. She has long been active in social movements, tackling issues from gender and women's rights, social, economic, environmental, and climate justice issues. Makoma is the Goldman Environmental Prize winner of 2018, and she successfully challenged a nuclear deal that was struck between the South African government and Russian governments. So I'll hand over to Makoma to start us off in the discussion and share her experience on how JETP is going in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Sis Thuli. Thank you for the people who have made time to come here. We know the Just Energy Transition Partnership, whenever the word is mentioned, people think that this is something that is going to bring about miracles, this is what is going to lead us into the hype of decarbonizing by 2050. However, there's a lot more that I think we have to look into. In Glasgow, South Africa received the Just Energy Transition Partnership that came from the International Partners Group in the form of the UK, Germany, France, and the European Union. And now lately, there's more countries that have joined this International Partners Group that are saying they want to assist South Africa in accelerating its just transition. A little bit of background is that this Just Energy Transition Partnership are a plurilateral structure for accelerating the phase out of fossil fuels. This intergovernmental partnership coordinates financial resources and technical assistance from countries in the global north to a recipient country to help in this regard. And in South Africa, when this was announced, obviously we welcomed that because already we had plans and we're in a process of developing a just transition framework. And for this just transition framework to be realized, obviously we needed funds. But however, as people or as citizens of the country, ordinary people, we were not involved, but though we welcomed that because when the funding came, it came in as loans and a little fraction of that as grants. And that is one thing that really made us raise eyebrows and question as to whether is this really a fund that is aimed at assisting in accelerating decarbonizing of our electricity system. The other thing that really worried us is that these concessional loans, we're told that the payback, it's not heavy, it's very less, but still we don't have like the real details. So there's some form of lacking of transparency in this just energy transition. But however, we find that because we look at this JETPs as another tool that would also assist us to decarbonize, but also we also looked at whether is there a justice factor in this just energy transition partnership. Actually, we had said that for us to be able to accelerate the just transition, we needed to have funds, but then the justice factor, that procedural justice, ordinary people should be part of deciding what plans, deciding what needs to be done, and also be taken along in the implementation process. And the other factor, the other justice issue that we raised was around restorative justice, that we do not want to see what contributed towards degrading our environment happening again. And also that if this just energy transition partnerships money come in, that should also benefit majority of the people, particularly those who are much older and those who need to be upskilled and reskilled. But then the issues that are coming up around this, whether this would be realized, it's around the shrinking of civil society space. Civil society is being weakened in many other countries, and in other countries it's either overt and others it's covert. So there's a lot of threats that are taking place, and the space is also not safe. So for an example, raising issues on the Just Energy Transition Partnership, because ours is linked also to the generation or manufacturing of green hydrogen, that's what we're told, it becomes a thorn. And what we hear from the international partners group is that there's a particular technology that is linked to this JETPs, and one of the technologies it's hydrogen, the other one it's electric vehicles, and these are not issues for ordinary people that they would really jump into. Electric vehicles, instead of having a public electric vehicles, then it's just electric vehicles, it's not detailed, and this would not benefit majority of the people. And on green hydrogen, this is a technology that has not been used in South Africa, but the manufacturing of green hydrogen seems like it's going back to that issue of questioning whether there is restorative justice. The lands where the project are aimed at are the lands where people are eking their livelihoods from the land and also nearer the seas, and that is raising a question. And we hear that this needs to be fast-tracked. But the worst that we feel that the Just Energy Transition Partnership would take place, would be accelerated. It's when those that have been wanting climate justice for quite a long time being protected. Climate protectors, activists, people who are protecting their biodiversity on a daily basis, would lay their lives down so that their biodiversity is not destroyed. These are the people that, if they are protected, then would say that this just transition would take place, because the just transition would not take place if it's imposed. It needs to take place and take into consideration the context of where people are and what is happening in those particular areas. So it is important that these partnerships are alive to environmental social safeguard, but more are alive to human rights protection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Makoma, for sharing with us the experiences in South Africa around the JETPs. We are going to be hearing from Guneet, Kaur, who is the Environmental Defenders Campaign Coordinator at International Rivers. She's a legal practitioner and researcher with a focus on international human rights and humanitarian law, comparative constitutional law and development. Guneet works with grassroots defenders, human rights defense networks that have been impacted communities and international civil society. So Guneet is going to share with us, one part of the JETPs that is critical to interrogate, the experiences of climate leaders in some countries, specifically Vietnam, where we have seen the targeting of climate leaders and with arrest, and also the shrinking of civic space. And Guneet is going to share with us, towards the end of her presentation, she's also going to share with us a video testimony from one climate leader in Vietnam. So over to you, Guneet.
Thanks, Suli. I would begin by saying that something my colleagues from Global Witness said the other day when we did a press conference. I'm not from Vietnam. I'm not Vietnamese. I don't know the perspectives of people in Vietnam with respect to just transitions. I don't know what their needs are with respect to a cleaner environment. What is just for the people of Vietnam. But unfortunately, I'm the one here talking about the Vietnam JETP, because 6 brilliant individuals, environmental human rights defenders, climate activists, were jailed by Vietnam on trumped-up charges of tax evasion, criminalization pertaining to appropriation of information, which frankly I feel is basically curtailing access to information. And they have been jailed in Vietnam, and they cannot talk about the JETP. Fortunately, for us, at a lot of risk for her own self, one of the activists who's in jail now for 2 years, lawyer Dang Ding Bak, he's a lawyer, and his partner, Thao, she has a message for us that she will share, and after that I will share my remarks. So that is at least a little bit of perspective that we get from somebody from Vietnam.
environmental activists coming back would like to improve environmental issues and support Vietnam in implementing sustainable development goals by provide solutions that cause less pollutant. He joined to policy advocacy to eliminate coal power, moving toward clean energy. He joined to promote the participation of local community in natural resources management through social and legal activities. And he coordinated the group Action for Justice, Environment and Health. That's what he did before he under arrest from June of 2021. Personally, as I see, the environmental issues in Vietnam is so dangerous, and the main purpose of that is a strong enforcement of environmental laws in Vietnam is urgent and upheld. From 2018 until his address, Bach was an active member of the Vietnam Energy Alliance, and he directly participating in policy advocacy for Vietnam's alternative energy planning. In my opinion, Vietnam's clean energy transition will not be possible while leading environmental activists like Bach and Hồng language in prison. I think that the work of Bach and other environmental activists in Vietnam Energy Alliance is so important for Vietnam's just transition, because the Vietnam energy transition needs the participation of independent experts who can speak the truth, who work for the benefits of community, not for political motive. Bach has been imprisoned for 30 months, and he's now struggling to survive. I think that the unjust address, the conviction and detention of environmental activists like Bach and Hồng is a systematic repression of Vietnamese government to hide the truth and intimidate the people's voice, especially those who advocate a transition away from coal. The international partners supporting Vietnam energy transition need to set up preconditions with the Vietnamese government before grants are made. That is the request to release environmental activists like Bach and Hồng, and make sure that members of civil society must be free to participate in their country transition to green energy. That the Vietnam clean energy transition will not be possible, and the billion promised to Vietnam will be wasted on false promise, and the solution to climate change that are so urgently needed will not manifest in this region. I would like to send my message to all the defenders movement and organization that come out in solidarity with Bach and Hồng. Thus, working to save our environment should not lead to such suffering. And we need global leaders to hold countries like Vietnam accountable. Without their swift intervention, we all stand to suffer tremendous loss. Collectively, we stand to lose our progress on mitigating climate change. And personally, I stand to lose my husband and the father of my only child. So really hope that we need to take action before it's too late.
Hello. And I think Thao's words explain that there is both a bigger cost to the Vietnam JETP story, which is we may or may not have a real energy transition, an effective energy transition, and there is a human cost to that story. I came into this role and I came into this campaign. As you see at the end of the video, there were a number of organizations that are part, and International Rivers is part of a campaign called the Vietnam Climate Defenders Coalition. The coalition has several regional and international human rights, environmental, climate justice organizations in it. Many of these individuals have worked with Bach, with Hong, with Khan, all these amazing individuals who and which is why they're part of this campaign, which is why we are here today talking about the Vietnam JETP and why defenders are important, because they've seen these individuals work tirelessly for decades, for the last quite a few decades on issues of environment for communities in Vietnam. The Vietnam JETP is a 15.5 billion just energy transition partnership between the IPG, the International Partners Group. My sense is that it's led by EU and UK within the IPG. And it has various stakeholders. It has the Asian Development Bank. It has the International Finance Corporation from the World Bank, which is the private sector side of the World Bank. It has the EIB involved. My sense is that the GIZ has also been quite much involved with the resource mobilization plan. So there are different governments involved. The UNDP is providing technical assistance for it. And you have Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is going to sort of get the private sector financing going, which is 50% of the Just Energy Transition Partnership deal. There were 4 individuals in the Vietnam Sustainable Energy Alliance called Dang Dinh Bach, Khan, Loy, and Duong. These 4 individuals, they advocated for Vietnam's transition away from coal. They made Vietnam commit to make a net zero commitment. And in 2020, in September 2020, they basically brought to light that while Vietnam has made a net zero commitment, the Power Development Plan 8, its zero draft, makes a lot of investment in coal. So the country's leadership was still thinking for future electricity production, it's going to come from coal. And they were trying to kind of bring to light the dissonance in what is the commitment that Vietnam is making to the whole world and what's really happening in between fine lines. In June 2021, Khan, Loy, and Duong, Bach, Loy, and Duong were picked up by the Vietnam police. They were picked up on tax evasion charges, corporate tax evasion. Dang Dinh Bach is a lawyer. He's an environmental activist. He runs something called the Law and Policy Sustainable Development Center. He's also, like we saw, he's a loving husband. He's a young father. His child was a toddler when he was arrested. Bach has trained over 100 young lawyers. He has worked on the banning of asbestos. He's worked on waste management legislation in Vietnam. He's worked with communities who've been impacted by hydro projects. So he's worked on various environmental projects over the years. Loy and Duong, they run a media company. Loy is a journalist. And Khan, so these, and then for all these months from June onwards, they advocated that what you're doing is not right. PDP, the Power Development Plan 8, has a lot of investment in coal, and it's not going to help us move away. They hosted TV talk shows, they wrote to governments, they organized a 17-day campaign on the PDP 8 for it to move away from coal. And then 3 of them were picked up in June 2021. Then Khan carried on the advocacy. She carried on at COP26. She came back and she spoke about while Vietnam at COP26 is saying, yes, we're going to have, we're going to move away from coal. They're making this declaration. That's not true. Your PDP is still very much dependent on coal. And then Khan was arrested in January. she was arrested on personal tax evasion charges. If you look at this report by an organization called Project 88, it shows that how the use of tax evasion charges and the sentences that were awarded to them is something that is not very common. Like, you don't criminalize tax evasion, one. I mean, one, whether there was tax evasion or not is a whole big question, but you don't criminalize tax evasion. This was a very rare case where people were being criminalized and incarcerated for tax evasion. And then in Khan's case, it was even more rare. This was a personal tax evasion charge on her Goldman Prize money, funnily. And so personal tax evasion criminalization is almost non-existent in Vietnam. The trials were all closed doors. They didn't last for more than an hour or two. Bach didn't get access to his lawyer for a very long time. The UN Working Group for Arbitrary Detention found out that, has held that Bach's detention is arbitrary. So have various other special procedures commented on the laws under which they were arrested and convicted, that these laws are vague, they're arbitrary. The tax laws have been used to sort of criminalize, silence civil society for a very long time. And they've had a sort of, effect of shrinking the civic space in Vietnam. And so there have been all these, since Khan was then released early, and very recently Loy was released. But the moment Khan was released, a couple of days later, another very amazing activist, Hong, was arrested. I know of Hong, I've heard of Hong from many of our colleagues here at COP from this organization called 350.org, because her organization Change was part of 350.org. And Khan is one of the most recognizable face of young climate activists coming out of Vietnam. She was one of the first Obama Scholar Fellows. And then Loy, when he was released, a week later, another person was arrested. They are not an environmental activist. They're an energy policy expert. And they've actually worked with some of the stakeholders, the ADB, the UNDP. Their name is Nguyen. And they were arrested on charges of appropriation of information. So what we have here is not cases of just 6 individuals. We have a case of systematic repression of civil society that begins the moment Vietnam's JETP is announced. The people who paved the way for Vietnam's JETP, they are somehow taken out of the conversation. And it's not just these 6 individuals. The effect is bigger. When the first 4 individuals, they ran a collective called the Vietnam Sustainable Energy Alliance. So the first 4 individuals, when they were arrested, the collective basically shut down. Their individual organizations stopped working. But then many other organizations also shut down out of fear, including Hong's organization. So Hong suspended the operations for change.org, and yet she still did get arrested. And now we are seeing it's not just environmental activists and environmental defenders, but any sort of interlocutor who's trying to understand that what are low-risk technologies, what are, how a transition can be just, how it can be effective for communities. Anybody who's even consulting or interlocuting with or outside organizations, they are effectively under, potentially they can be criminalized. And that's scary for a lot of Vietnamese organizations, and that should also be scary for stakeholders who are involved in the JETP. And while I was researching for, what are our advocacy options for these organizations? So I'm somebody who's worked in development finance sort of advocacy with communities for years. And usually all these organizations, development finance institutions, they have certain basic environmental social safeguard policies. But what's happening here is you have a bunch of development finance organizations. So when we write to the IFC or when we write to the ADB, their response is, yes, we deeply care about our safeguard policies. So as and when the projects will start, we will look at, or we will do the environmental due diligence, we will do the consultations, we will do everything, including the UNDP. And but right now, this is what it is. We are taking note of the situation. But by the time you get to the project level, there is going to be nobody to organize the community. There is going to be nobody to figure out between the fine lines what the government is saying outside and what it's actually doing. Like Khan and Bach were doing, like they did with the PDP 8, that you are saying, you're getting this JETP, you're saying at COP that we're going to go net zero, but actually your plans are not really net zero. And today the PDP stands very different. The final PDP that was passed, it is not as coal dependent as the last PDP, as the PDP that they were critiquing. So in many ways, they stand vindicated today. The work they did was taken, different stakeholders, governments, they did take note of it, they pushed back, which is why their role is important in this like big ecosystem of multi-stakeholder partnerships and of other environmental defenders. But because there are so many stakeholders, it's very easy to push the buck. And we are not saying that there should be contingencies in financing when it moves from global north to global south. No. But a basic commitment we all have to basic human rights, to a right to speech, to a right to association, to accountability, to transparency, to participation, because only then can a transition be just. I was at the very beginning of when I came here, I was in a joint MDB session as an audience member. And there was the ADB that was moderating, there was AFDEP, there was the IDB, there was somebody from the World Bank, there was also somebody from the ILO, and they were discussing just transitions. And the discussion there was primarily around jobs and around capacity building. And then I moved into, a couple of days ago, we were in a discussion which one of our partners had organized with different defenders from across the world on just transitions. And there everybody was talking about accountability, participation, and transparency. So you have two bubbles which are not sort of, and the first bubble is not listening to the other. Yes, both are needed. Jobs are very much part of it. But jobs, what are meaningful jobs? What is meaningful capacity building will not be possible without, having accountability process, without having civil society at the center of it, without having transparency, which will not happen if there is, you are potentially criminalizing access to information. So given this situation, all of us, the resource mobilization plan has come up. There is large investment, projected investment in hydro. There is large projected investment in something, plantation-based repurposing, both of which are very scary because it can lead to damage, it can lead to displacement of communities. But I shouldn't be the one commenting on it. Bach, Khan, they should be here. And so at this moment, is the Just Energy Transition Partnership really heading towards a just energy transition? No, not without the defenders. And is it heading towards even a meaningful energy transition? We don't know, because frankly, there's just a lot of repurposing in the RMP that I can see. Thank you.
Thank you, Guneet, for that enlightening intervention. Indeed, the criminalization of defenders is not only, detrimental to their participation, specific participation in the JETP conversations, but it also has a chilling effect on other community and general public who would have wanted to participate in the space. And for the JETPs to become a reality and work, a number of stakeholders are assisting governments or participating in the JETPs. And we are lucky on this panel that we have Ingrid-Gabriela Hoven, who is the Managing Director for GIZ, the German Development Agency. She previously served as Executive Director representing Germany on the Board of Directors of the World Bank. And she has also served in a number of senior roles in the German government, including as Director General at BMZ, the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. So Ingrid, can you please talk to us about how, the role of GIZ in JETPs and how GIZ is ensuring civic space and public participation? And maybe also give us your comments on the way forward for ensuring participation, transparency, accountability in JETP framework from government, partners, and development agencies.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, and sorry for being late. Bit of a trouble to find this room. But let me start by really saying that I explicitly decided to make time for this dialogue today. And this is not the first one with civil society organizations on how they feel actually, how climate and energy partnerships more in general, and especially also JETPs are evolving. Because quite frankly, GIZ is an organization that works in 80 countries. We have been in the climate arena for quite a while. We are supporting the German government in climate negotiations, also partially in building a bridge to partner countries, to civil society organizations. And for us, it's extremely helpful to get a direct feedback from our learning experiences in processes that require a deep change. And when we speak about JETPs, when we speak about getting to net zero, this is an extremely profound change in the society, in the economy, and it really changes livelihoods for many, many people. And quite frankly, we are facing in Germany, we are also struggling in finding the right answers, partially when specific groups, regions are affected, really to balance out the, so to say, the climate transition that is required in order to get us into a perspective of a safer and more secure and more resilient future, but at the same time really to take care of those people that may be directly or indirectly affected by this change. And as I was online, this is a learning process. It's extremely difficult to orchestrate a transition, and here and there I would say certainly we come to first conclusions, but not in all the cases we already have finalized answers. What becomes obvious perhaps in a nutshell at the very beginning, that more and more when this new concept of partnership got started, that possibly those that were engaged on both sides, I mean the governments plus the international organizations, they were concentrated much more on the core climate issues, on the energy transition, no? Getting out of coal, getting the energy sector restructured, etc. And possibly, I mean, the impact was a little bit like an afterthought, but it was not the other way around, quite frankly. Now we have to recognize, in order to get to net zero, in order to come to a resilient economy, this has to do much more about really empowering people to be able to do the transformation, to be an active part of the transformation and not to simply absorb the transformation. So normally one would say the just part in a JETP should normally start from the very beginning, forcefully, in order to equip institutions, civil society organizations, local communities to deal with the change. And a little bit what we are now seeing is actually that we have realized that we have to deal with the just element much more forcefully from the very beginning. We need more resources, because partially when you look at how do we actually finance this balancing out, it's not that clear. When you do, for instance, local infrastructure for local communities, or you do this capacity building, upskilling, reskilling, small enterprise promotion programs, where does this funding come from? It is not counted against the climate financing goals. So partially you also see some hesitation in the decision-making bodies to give it an equivalent priority like the money that goes into the restructuring of the energy sector. So these are part of the issues that I wanted to share with you. I mean, just some preliminary observations. As us, we are a technical cooperation agency, so we do less with the financing, quite frankly. We are not really heavily involved in the resource planning. but we are much more involved in what actually in the enabling environment, in providing advice, and also in cooperating with the government. What are our key principles? I mean, we have elaborated a concept paper, what we consider as absolutely core and center when we enter a JETP program. And let me only pick up 3 of them, but for us, this is very important. One, the first principle is nothing about us without us, which means for us, clear and frankly, when you transform the energy sector, you have to bring all stakeholders on board. And not only the governmental institutions, utilities, and the energy ministry, but really, and not only the private sector, but this sometimes also is important, but you have to bring affected communities and civil society representation to the table. But you of course know, and you have described this right now, and a very, very sad story of developments, but we have to face the truth that in some countries the freedoms of citizens to express their interests is limited. And so the question for us also as a governmental organization or working on behalf of the German government is that we should not shy away in observing what are the perhaps from a donor perspective unintentional consequences if you operate in a certain transformative way in a country that actually doesn't give freedom of expression and sufficient voice to civil society organization. Do we approach things in a way that we stabilize authoritarian structures and even perhaps restrict participation? In any case, GIZ, where we are involved in those countries and we are advising ministries, we always plead for a multi-stakeholder approach. Second principle, distributing opportunities and risk equitably, so more or less, I mean a balanced approach. I think all of us here in the room, and even when we speak to governments, actually they would say, yeah, this is right. And we have to create new opportunities for those that are affected by the loss of jobs, loss of livelihoods. There are some that are directly disadvantaged. For instance, when you look into some of the JETPs, when we speak about getting out of coal. Okay, how many minutes do I have left?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. But the problem may be that we actually see in the sequence of time that some may lose the jobs immediately, some people over time, so there we have more time really to create new opportunities. But for those that are immediately affected, we have to think more forcefully about safety nets. Third point, leave no one behind. That is partially covered by the point I've just raised. So for us in the energy transition, it's not just about climate, it's not just about energy, but it's explicitly about people. There are ways where we have actually created in JETPs platforms where civil society organizations are being invited to express their views. Some countries are more open-minded to do this in an institutionalized way. Some others are a little bit more reluctant. Because we know this, quite frankly, and the German government was quite cognizant about the shrinking space for civil society organization in some countries, about the difficulties in actually balancing out opportunities and the impact of transition towards net zero in some countries. He not only asked GIZ in their advisory programs to deal with participatory issues and to weave them into our doing where it is feasible, but as we know that some governments are not that open-minded, the German government has commissioned a big program which is being implemented by a German NGO and has like partners in JETP countries, in Senegal, Vietnam, South Africa, and Indonesia. And they are working also in parallel to capacitize civil society organization. And I just coming from a meeting, one of those organizers of the program, and we are going to look into, because now we are like halfway in the implementation of this civil society capacity building program. And they give us a feedback, a sincere feedback, how their partners in the respective countries, what they observe, how they see actually the progress made in the JETPs, and how they see what additionally should be implemented in order to make those programs more just than they are right now. And this feedback, we take this very seriously. We try to work from our side through the government towards opening spaces. And I can only underline that also the German government, State Secretary Jochen Flassbart met with representatives from those countries quite recently. So this is very much on our radar screen, and I want to rest you assured, it's not an easy way ahead. The transition as such is difficult. Shrinking spaces is an alarming signal for all of us. But thirdly, we are at your side. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. We are encouraged to hear that the German government and indeed GIZ is taking seriously and thinking about how to broaden the multi-stakeholder consultations in the different countries around JETPs, and specifically around the issues of human rights and public participation. We are lucky that we have Marlon Apañada, who is going to share with us what the business community is doing around the same challenges of, protecting civic space and also making sure that business and human rights are inclusive for in the investment environment. Marlon is the Southeast Asia Engagement Lead for Energy and Climate at World Resources Institute, and he brings 15 years in-depth experience in the clean energy space. He was also the convener of the Greening the Banks initiative, an ASEAN-wide program aiming to mobilize private sector participation in green finance. Marlon, please, you have 3 minutes to share with us, the private sector actors' perspective on human rights and compliance and inclusive development.
Thank you very much. It is a privilege and honor to be in this panel, and thanks to International Rivers, EarthLife Africa, and Urduwald for giving this space for the World Resources Institute, WRI, to contribute our thoughts. So WRI, in the ecosystem of NGO and civil society partners in Southeast Asia, occupies a unique space of being the convener and coordinator of private sector corporates to lend their voice and demand in the ongoing energy transition story, being the Secretariat for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and the recently convened Asia Clean Energy Coalition with some of the big foreign direct investors in Asia. The shared ambition of the civil society and other NGOs with corporate ambitions in decarbonization, in having credible and transparent decarbonization pathways, is something that we would like to emphasize in Southeast Asia, especially that most of the corporate emissions are really in supply chains. For example, a big brand like Nike will have 300 factories in Bandung, Indonesia alone. And the supply chain partners of a big corporate like Apple spans Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, across Southeast Asia, across Asia. So we are cognizant of the shrinking civic space. We have colleagues in Vietnam that have been subject to the legal process and being in fact, like put into prison. And this is a big conversation right now among the business community on what we can contribute given the fragility and sensitivity of the situation. We are, it is, and indeed, it is, it is a sensitive matter, and we are, we recognize and acknowledge that for policy asks on the decarbonization pathway, we need the government, but the government, especially in several of the Southeast Asian jurisdictions that we operate, do not want a very forceful message, or else there will be pushback. It's an to be frank about it, it's an ongoing conversation. There have been initiatives to put corporate voices to demand for release, for more flexible ways to engage with civil society. But understandably so, many of the companies will be reticent to put their names and identities forward. It is what it is, and it is the reason why I was, it was important for me to represent the Institute in this conversation, because it is a truly a balancing act with the inside and outside ways to engage with governments that have acute sensitivities from civil society. This will not be solved in a single panel or in a series of conversations, but it will be a multi-year engagement, not just among the community of private sector players, but also with nonprofits, governments, and the general community that could really help ensure credibility, transparency, and credibility and transparency as we aim for just energy transitions in such an important region as Southeast Asia. Center of supply chains of the global economy, poised to be the 4th largest economy in the world, 650 million people, with a majority of which going into the middle class. Southeast Asia will be the center of many of the conversations that we are having, and this will be an ongoing conversation.
Thank you, Marlon, for those brief comments. And we now will hear from Dr. Pichamon, who is a UN independent expert serving as the Asia-Pacific member on the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. She is also head of research of the Center for Future Defense and National Security at Deakin University. Pichamon, can you please take a few minutes, sharing with us the relevant recommendations from the recent UN Business and Human Rights Working Group thematic report on the just transition and extractive industries?
Sure, absolutely, and thank you so much for that kind introduction and for inviting me to be part of this session. I really must thank the co-organizers for putting together this very important session on a very timely topic and a complex one, as the other speakers have already highlighted, but for extending space to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights to be a part of this conversation and what hopefully will become a much larger dialogue as well, because as I think has already been underscored, we really, really need dialogue when it comes to aligning understandings of what just transition needs to look like in the Asia-Pacific region, in the Middle East, in any part of the world, really. For those of you who don't know much about the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, let me just briefly tell you who we are. So I am the member from Asia-Pacific states, but altogether our working group has 5 experts, each representing different regions of the world. As independent experts who work as part of the fact-finding and monitoring mechanism of the UN Human Rights Council, we hold the mandate from states to promote, disseminate, and implement what are known as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. In fulfilling this mandate, we engage in a range of mandated activities. This includes country visits, and we just recently conducted one in Japan and previously, earlier this year, to Argentina. We also engage in reports, in writing up thematic reports that are then submitted to the Human Rights Council as well as the General Assembly. So I'm going to speak briefly to one of the reports that we just submitted to the General Assembly this past November on the extractive sector and just transition, but also touch on some other reports that I think are pertinent to the discussion that we're having today. And obviously, as part of our mandate, we engage with a wide range of stakeholders, governments, businesses, and of course, civil society and communities impacted by business-related human rights abuses as well. And so, in view of all of the complexity when it comes to the question of what constitutes a just transition and how can it actually occur, I think it's important for us to go back to the basics in one sense and really ask ourselves, do we all understand what just transition even means? Are we actually on the same page? Because I get the sense that over the course of this COP28, there have been many different interpretations of just transition that have been put forward, and I feel very vindicated by all of the nodding heads in the room right now. And I'm not going to say that I have the answer to this, but I think the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the International Labour Organization, as part of their joint report on human rights and a just transition, they provided us with a pretty good departure point when it comes to understanding what just transition means and what it needs to look like. And so let me quote a quick sentence from the report here. According to the report, the term just transition refers to the transition to a human rights economy that is fair, equitable, inclusive, and sustainable, creates decent work opportunities, reduces inequalities and poverty, as well as upholds the human rights of workers and affected communities, in particular indigenous peoples and communities affected by environmental degradation and by the measures that are needed to address it. I think that's a pretty comprehensive understanding of just transition, but what is most important about that specific definition is the fact that human rights are put front and center. And this is not what we see enough of when it comes to a lot of the discussions that, even the ones that we hear here, right? We do not see human rights being put front and center when we think about what it means to be transitioning in a sustainable manner, in a way that respects the rights of all of those who stand to be impacted by such a transition. Not just migrant workers, not just workers more broadly, but equally indigenous peoples, of course, as we know, many of whom stand to bear the most, to bear the brunt of the so-called renewable energy transition when it comes to the exploitation of critical minerals, for instance. And so for the working group, we do view that the transition to renewable energy must not come at the price of social justice or inclusion for that fact. And when it comes to the region I work on, the Asia Pacific, which, mind you, based on the UN's worldview, also includes the Middle East, the just transition that we see in this region must not create new injustices either, whether these be, again, for indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, women, children, and any other group that is at risk. And we also need to acknowledge, because this term has been raised, right, the whole idea of leaving no one behind. As important as this concept is, and you know, we all know that it's been very influential, we have to also recognize that there has been a lot of focus on leaving no one behind, but not enough attention given to what comes before leaving no one behind, which is reaching those furthest behind first. And this is what I've been saying in a number of events already, which is that over the years, I feel like there has been insufficient recognition given to the fact that in many parts of the world, many have already been left behind, and that we need to take immediate action to reach these marginalized and at-risk groups first. You know, in the report on our report to the General Assembly on the extractive sector and just transition and human rights, we note, for instance, that the essential minerals needed to manufacture batteries for electric vehicles, solar, wind, and other renewable energy infrastructure has already come at an expense, at a social expense. The ILO, for one, has revealed how more than 1 million children worldwide are being forced to work in dangerous cobalt and coltan mines in order to fuel this energy transition. And so this is why, going to the point that you were making previously, it is so critical to ensure that good safety nets are in place, but also to ensure the more equitable distribution of responsibilities, as well as all the benefits of economic growth for the sake of social justice. And so really this is not just about the outcome, it's equally about the process, how we actually get there. We know that when it comes to environmental and energy policies, many of these are often done in a very top-down manner. And there needs to be more grassroots engagement. We also need to look beyond the energy in the just transition. We need to also look at how there is currently a lack of a social agenda when it comes to the many net zero policy frameworks that businesses have in place. And we also need to recognize that there is a continuing lack of access to information. This is an issue that has been raised many times, not just by civil society and communities impacted by the renewable energy transition, but equally by businesses and investors themselves. I've heard this from investors most recently over the course of my discussions just about 2-3 weeks before this, where they were saying that because we don't have information about what's going on in the mines, for instance, it's much harder for us to know what we need to do. You might want to question or push back on that, but the reality is the lack of credible, reliable information is a real problem. And what we need immediately, again, is transparency, but we also need to ensure with that comes accountability. And so this is something that my fellow panelists have already emphasized, which is stakeholder engagement, multi-stakeholder engagement, and social dialogue are extremely important when it comes to ensuring that the shift to a more sustainable economy, to a just transition, actually happens. And this needs to encompass the entire economic spectrum, from energy and transport to agriculture to financial services. And indeed, the working group is currently working on a report to the Human Rights Council for next year on the role of investors when it comes to implementing the guiding principles on business and human rights. And earlier this year, we also released a report outlining the very clear obligations and responsibilities that development financial institutions have when it also comes to protecting and respecting human rights. And so I've spoken a little bit already about the guiding principles, and for those of you who have never heard about the UNGPs before, you might be wondering what exactly are they? So the guiding principles, in brief, are a normative framework that have been agreed by states, and which apply to all states because they are predicated on international human rights law, and which set out the obligations that states have to protect human rights, as well as the responsibilities that the private sector, that businesses have when it comes to respecting human rights. And the guiding principles apply to all companies of all sizes, in every sector, in every single country. Of course, the guiding principles are voluntary, and some have said that this is what makes the guiding principles less impactful. But at the same time, their voluntary nature is also what allows them, what lends themselves to ensuring more dialogue happens in this space. And already I noted how, I think we haven't really been talking much enough about how human rights need to be at the center of a lot of the discussions we've been having here on the just transition. But it's also the case that human rights more generally seems to be rather absent from a lot of the discussions that we have here. Earlier today, I was in one session where the term ESG, environmental, social, and governance, the factors that businesses need to now take into consideration was mentioned as a concept guiding financial actor, and how it was, in one sense, an evolution from the old idea of corporate social responsibility, but there was no discussion about business and human rights. And that signals to us as a working group that we need to do more, but it also is fundamentally problematic for reasons that I think many of you here in the room and those of you listening online can appreciate. And the reason for that is because, as someone outside wore a t-shirt saying this, the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, right? The energy transition is urgently needed in order to avert and minimize catastrophic human rights harms related to climate change. The UN guiding, not the UN guiding principles, the UN General Assembly has already unanimously affirmed that the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a human right for all. And so this means that we need vigilance to ensure that a human rights-centered approach is applied to how we, as a global society, move together on these issues. And this is why I feel the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights can offer us a pathway, a framework for talking about these issues and for talking in particular about how a JETP, a Just Energy Transition Partnership, can happen in a way that is rights-respecting. And to that point, I want to also note that, further to the report that the working group has published on development finance institutions, we do note that investors and financial institutions, especially DFIs, play a very important role in this regard because given their unique ownership structure, right, DFIs in particular, the fact that states own, control, and or substantially support their mandates, this actually requires states to take additional measures to protect against human rights abuses related to these institutions. And so, in that regard, DFIs need to operate in accordance with international human rights laws as well as environmental standards, and they need to acknowledge how they have the responsibility to respect human rights, and they have to exercise what we call human rights due diligence when it comes to identifying, preventing, and addressing the adverse human rights impacts associated with their operations, with their development value chains, as well as their business relationships. And this responsibility to respect human rights, again, is also extended to investors in view of the guiding principles. And altogether, what this means is that in relation to JETPs, for instance, that we see in South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam, it is important that those who are involved in financing these JETPs are also accountable for the impacts of these partnerships and also for what is happening in these countries. I feel Guneet's frustration when at one point she was not able to really voice the extent of her frustration and really had to pause when talking about the climate and environmental human rights defenders that have been put in jail in Vietnam on questionable grounds. And that is indeed frustrating, because how can you have a just energy transition if your leading minds who are advocating for the environment, for climate sustainability, are not there in the public domain talking about these issues and pushing both the government and businesses involved to do even better? If there is no multi-stakeholder engagement, then there can be no real meaningful dialogue. Inclusion becomes just another buzzword that we're just throwing out there. And this is very problematic again, because it means that many of the things that have happened so far will easily become just simply another step in the right direction, but which will never really truly eventuate into the ultimate outcome that we all hope. And what I wanted to say here is that we're not, in view of the guiding principles, we're not saying that investors or financial institutions need to disengage or divest completely from these types of engagements or these types of partnerships or initiatives. Rather, what they need to be thinking about is how can they use their leverage in order to ensure that there is better conduct, that there is more rights-respecting behavior on the part of governments, but also on the part of the businesses involved in financing and implementing an energy transition. Leverage is really important here because sometimes exiting a relationship is the easier way forward. The harder way forward is one where you are engaging and you're trying to use your influence to ensure that more rights-respecting behavior is coming to the forefront. And so I feel like I've been speaking a lot already, and I think my time might be up soon, sooner rather than later. But what I do want to emphasize again is that from the perspective of the guiding principles, states have the obligation to protect human rights. Businesses, including investors, have the responsibility to respect human rights. And this means also protecting human rights defenders, ensuring that they are not subject to reprisals. It is about ensuring that they are voices that are engaged with meaningfully when it comes to discussions about the just transition, what it needs to look like in specific country contexts and in different regions, but also when it comes to ensuring that there is genuine multi-stakeholder dialogue. Because ultimately, energy transition programs need to be designed with international human rights standards, as well as the UN guiding principles in mind. And it needs to be about not just doing good, but also about doing no harm. Calling for a just transition isn't just about lofty values. It is fundamentally about all of our survivability. This is an issue that many of our colleagues in the Pacific, for one, are already aware of, and they've been so for a while now. But working to secure a clean, just, and sustainable energy future is really in our common interest. And so we really cannot afford any more greenwashing, and we certainly cannot afford any more rights washing, which is what, unfortunately, we seem to be getting more of in this space. And with that, I'll hand it over back to our moderator, but really I just wanted to emphasize today that this is our collective responsibility, and it is important that we listen to those who are most affected and that we listen to the human rights defenders and the communities who oftentimes serve and act as our moral conscience, even when it comes at very real physical risk to them, to their livelihoods, and most importantly, to their communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists. At this point, I think they have given us enough for us to think about or even maybe raised some questions that we would like to pose to them, and also maybe comments on some aspects of what they have presented to us. So at this point, I'll take questions and answers from our participants.
Hello, good evening everyone. My name is Mayalmit. I am from Northeast India. So I have a question. We see hydro making a big comeback in the name of just transition, even in Vietnam, JETP, but hydro is not a climate resilient transition. It causes a lot of harm. Like I just wanted to share, on 4th of October 2023, we had a massive flash floods. Like it washed away 1,200 megawatts, one of the largest dam in our region because of glacier lake outburst, you know. So about what is just happened. How is hydro is a just transition? I just wanted to know that.
Thank you. We'll take maybe 3 questions.
Hi everyone. My name is Daouda Dieng. I'm economist for NRGI and I'm based in Dakar, Senegal, one of the countries, one of the JETP countries. So my question is, what kind of practical mechanism could be put in place to ensure that multi-stakeholder participatory process is inclusive and increase accountability and representation of civil society? What I mean is it can be complicated for the government to talk with all civil society organizations and how we make sure that the one chosen by the government during consultation processes are accountable to all the civil society constituency, and make sure that all the contribution and perspective are well taken account.
Okay, thank you very much to all the panelists and to Dr. Pichamon, if I may put it that way, for bringing it home in terms of these conversations that we have been having, that we all agree that we need an energy transition because of the climate crisis, but I think the biggest question has been how. And I think the framework that you provided there in terms of how we can ensure that we have this just energy transition, I think has been very helpful, especially as provided or as defined by the UN. But my question to you is, when we raise these issues as defenders, as activists, to our governments. They don't listen. And that's why our work gets criminalized. So my question to you is, so what is the UN doing, or at least your working group, to make sure that our governments get this message that we are not against energy transition. We are very much supportive as activists, but it's the how. I think you stand a better chance because of what the UN stands for and what the UN Working Group stands for in terms of trying to pass on that message compared to us, who are regarded as people that are anti-development and all those other things. So my biggest question to you is, what is the UN doing? What is the UN Working Group, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner, doing to make sure that our governments get this message? My name is Mtuso Liwayo. I'm the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association.
Can I make a quick question too? I wanted to ask you about how you see this process of discussing a just energy transition work program going on here at the COP. This morning, a statement was issued from a high-level interministerial meeting that happened on the 3rd, which makes reference to human rights, but very sort of tangentially. It's not at the center. And I'm wondering if some of these issues that were brought up and the kind of ideas that were just presented, how they could become more front and center within this process, within the UN, including the issue of participatory planning. I mean, most countries have no national plan for a just energy transition or a transition at all. And if that process of an actual plan, rather than just sort of projects that appear that are of interest to some corporate group, if that really happened in a participatory way with people like Hong and Bach being able to participate, you would have a framework for that. And you could have international institutions like JZ or the IFC supporting that sort of process, both technically but also using their leverage to help ensure there's more transparency and participation. It seems like that would be a starting point, having an overarching plan for the different countries and regions, and then really internalizing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and having that language be incorporated. It seems like if we could have something with teeth in it and that was really strong, we could avoid some really serious problems that are already happening. And with all this discussion about ramping up renewables and everything else, I think there's huge danger from what we've already seen. So I think we are at a critical moment. So the question is, what can we do now, rather than waiting for more situations like we just saw in Vietnam? Thanks.
Thank you. My proposal is we take maybe the last question or two more, and then we give our speakers an opportunity to respond and give their last remarks.
Thank you, and I would like to address the concrete question to Ms. Kaur. I'm an Ekpluzhniko from Perspectives, and several months ago I left Russia, and I have to say that the situation you are describing right now, with regard to those people who are in prison, with regard to ecological activists, with regard to all the stuff related to the transparency and many other things, we had it 10 years ago. And in general, we had many voices with regard to, well, what is good, what is bad, whether the society should be transparent, open, and all this stuff. We discussed many times what to do with this. But unfortunately, right now, in 10 years, we are here, where there is absolutely no transparency in Russia. A great number of ecological, not ecological, but political activists are in prison right now. And I can easily imagine what will happen in Vietnam in some 3, 5, 10 years. The situation will become worse. Though we discuss here the issues of transparency, how to provide the participation of of civil society and all this stuff, it's very important. It's very important to discuss this from the perspective of the future. But we have a very concrete situation right now. 6, as far as I remember, 6 years, activists are in prison right now. And they don't want to take care of what will happen with, for example, participation of civil society in some 5, 10 years. It is necessary to do something very actively right now and to make strong decisions. And the question is, If you are, for example, the head of the World Bank, or one of the CEO of the World Bank, you have money to invest into Vietnam, what would you do? Will you close your project activities, bearing in mind that, well, I have predicted right now the future, if nothing happens, this is business as usual scenario. A great number of people in prison in 3, 5, 10 years. What will you do? You have the possibility to invest into something. What is your plan of activities? Maybe your 1, 2, 3 first steps in order to extract these people, to provide freedom to those people who are in prison right now. Thank you.
My question will go to the UN representative and the GIZ representative. We are talking about JETP and human rights defenders, and one of your ending remark was that defenders are our moral compass. In most of our countries, we do not have policies for protection of defenders. So how are you working closely with the UN Working Group on Protection of Defenders to at least ensure we have laws to protect even as we plan for just transition? And to GIZ, in terms of support, what kind of support are you extending towards protection of defenders who are working on these projects? Thank you.
Thank you so much. At this point, we'll give an opportunity to all our speakers to do their final comments and respond to as much of the questions as possible. Unfortunately, we have limited time, but there is an opportunity to continue engaging with our speakers even beyond this event. I'll start with Makoma. And
Thank you very much for this the discussion, and I think this is what we should continuously do even when you go back to our homes. I'll just respond to one of the comments or the questions that were asked, and this is kind of a learning from South Africa. South Africa has got what is called the Presidential Climate Change Commission, and this commission is comprised of members, citizens from different sectors of society. So there's a 22-member group of the commissioners from civil society, from labor, from business, from research institutions, and this is kind of another model. I'm not saying it's the best model, but it's another model of how the broader society, community can engage in the discussions and also raise issues and be involved in the planning and the implementation of the transition. But I must say that for us who are part of that commission, it's a contested terrain, but however, we feel that this is something that would continuously do, particularly because we want climate justice. Luckily, we have a just transition framework, which is a guideline, and I think upon reflection, maybe that guideline, because it's not cast in stone, one of the things that would need to, when we do reflection, it's around the protection of climate protectors or biodiversity protectors or people who are protecting their territories, so that you don't find people being harassed, being threatened. Like I said when I started talking here, I said there are people who are, there's different situations. In other countries, you find that there's covert oppression, repression. Not anybody can detect it. And those who are being threatened, those who are being maimed, at the end of the day, we would not even link that to them raising issues around unjust, undemocratic practices or being silenced and not to raise issues around protecting their biodiversity. Besides that, there's also where there's overt repression. So the countries are different. We've just had examples of Vietnam and other countries where there's overt repression, and I think this is something that I think it's important that the UN rapporteur should put at their priority, focus on those countries that are getting the JETP, because we also sometimes say we welcome the JT, but we see that as another form of energy colonization coming in a different form. Thank you.
I'll try to be very quick. I think in terms of defenders and participatory approach, it is very important that the stakeholders, especially some like the ADB and all, but especially the UNDP in the Vietnam case, because it's a case of UN washing there. They take the lead in having an effective reprisals and protection of defenders policy. That's a very basic thing that's needed. Sir, to your question specifically, I think third world scholars on international law have written to a large extent on, we can go back and forth on the Bretton Woods system and its pros and cons, and we can discuss that outside. I come from India, and I know it's hard, like that ecosystem to speak, to talk, to make it is hard. But from India, back in the 90s, when the Narmada protests were happening, that did lead to a big pushback, and the World Bank built the inspection panel, which was one of the first in that case of an accountability mechanism. And to this date, that something like even the AIIB is thinking of an accountability mechanism. So I think that the civil society, the global solidarity is must to push back. So the movement rose from India, but it had a global solidarity and it led to an inspection panel. So even within these institutions that we critique, coming from the global south, coming from spaces where we feel that such kind of financing may not be okay, we do need mechanisms that there has been spaces that have opened for dialogue, and I think we have to explore those ways. We have to go back to those lessons.
Yeah, coming back to the question about hydro and specific issues also regarding critical minerals and the overall concept of the transformation of economies. I just want to underline, of course, we as an institution also have a full-fledged environmental and safeguard system in place, dealing also with issues of diversity and gender. So regardless whether this project or program participates in a JETP overall package, for each and every project we really see we have a principle, do no harm. We try to work gender sensitive throughout what we are doing, and especially with respect to the energy mix. Of course, when you want to transition, for instance, from a fossil fuel economy to a net zero economy, you should take actually the future climate impact into consideration and decide whether hydro really is an option. And if you do hydro, then of course you should do it in a way that it actually doesn't destroy livelihoods, but you do it really in an environmentally and social responsible way. We have many lessons learned of the past where big hydro didn't work properly. And second point on the defenders, not all can be covered actually by a JETP program, but we have in place as GIZ in programs, but also additionally the German government human rights capacity building programs. Capacity building is not the right word. Programs that actually supports human rights organizations, civil society, in the global south, and we hope by doing so that they get a bigger space within their own political sphere. And of course there were actually those human rights defenders that have been worked with us or in principle are being jailed or are not being respected. This is part of the political dialogue that our foreign minister is conducting, and you may have noticed that here and there this is not highly welcomed, but we try to stick to our values and principles.
So thank you so much for all of your excellent questions. I don't think I will be able to do them justice in the time remaining, so I would really welcome further engagement with each of you. Following on from that, I think it's, from what you were saying, it is important that we get the fundamentals right? And in terms of building out the structure that underscores or underpins these JETP programs, it is important that human rights training is very much part of that. What we often find when it comes to, your question about how do we conduct more genuine or really just genuine multi-stakeholder dialogues, a lot of the time it does come from a lack of awareness of the local context. It comes from a lack of actual human rights training on the part of those facilitators who go in for those site visits. And it is oftentimes for investors, again, I recently spoke to a number of them, having boots on the ground and having the ability to go to the affected communities and speaking with them directly. They will say that they don't currently have the capacity to do so, but it's important for them to actually have that capacity and to continue to build up that capacity as well. I mean, ultimately, the idea of free, prior, and informed consent often gets used in relation to Indigenous peoples and the importance of them providing their free, prior, and informed consent, but it really applies to all multi-stakeholder dialogues. It is important that those part of the dialogue have access to information, that they are also partaking in the dialogues in a way that they do not feel in any way burdened or pressured to say certain things or to agree to certain things. And this is very much part of ensuring that there are participatory planning processes that are in place that are indeed inclusive, and to ensure that energy transition plans are also inclusive of the diversity of perspectives that often come to the fore. And here I completely agree with your point about the importance of ensuring policy coherence as well. And the UN guiding principles are very much coherent with the M&E, the ILO's M&E declaration, with the different ILO standards, and indeed with the OECD guidelines too. And so we do have that foundation already in place. The question is always about the actual implementation at the local level. And so again, I think I'll end on the point about how do we get governments to listen. I would say that's a very complex question, and I won't be able to address it in the next 10 seconds. But what I'll say is it's not just about getting governments to listen. It's also about getting the businesses and the investors to listen. Because ultimately, they are the ones that are providing the financing for a lot of these initiatives. And the businesses, in my experience at least, once they find out how problematic human rights abuses are, not just for society, but equally for their own bottom lines, they have a greater incentive to actually stop and to listen. But with that, I welcome further engagement. Sorry.
Yeah, just quickly to wrap up the panel, there's a lot of mention about the business community and the private sector, and this is really around making ourselves a chorus among governments, among civil society, the business and investment community, in order for us to make the energy transition more inclusive, more responsive, and more sustainable. The energy transition is already well underway. Vietnam in 2020 put in 40 gigawatts of new solar projects that they could not take into the grid. The Philippines has implemented ambitious auctions programs for solar and wind that saw agricultural lands becoming converted to industrial lands that are now threatening food security. Energy transition will happen, especially with a tripling of renewables to 2030, seeing 1.5 terawatts of new capacity that will be built. What do we do now? We have to make things more inclusive, more responsive, and more sustainable. And it can only be done by a chorus of government, civil society, businesses, and investors. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone for coming. We can continue having the conversations outside of the space. We're out of time, and thank you to the organizers.
Thank you so much.